The final topic involving nature is the tea house. And I'm not going to get too deeply into the actual ceremony of tea in Japanese culture, but understand it's very ritualistic and a very sacred ceremony that is undertaken. There's a lot of rule following, right, that has to be done, right, as it's undertaken. Most tea houses are set in nature. So here we're looking at this tea house set out in the natural world and uses natural elements right in its design. And when you enter into a tea house, just like a Shinto temple, typically there's a cleansing that has to happen, the washing of the face and the mouth and such. So there's a sense of having to clean yourself before you entered into the space. When you enter most tea house spaces, they're quite stark, quite simplistic, and they focus on natural elements in design. If you look at the ground, you'll notice they have tatami mats, which are basically woven fiber mats that are woven from bamboo and other fibers. You also will see the fusama or the sliding walls that are made of rice paper. And then you also see that typically there are things for you to focalize your attention on. Usually there's a piece of art. So here you'll see there's a piece of calligraphic writing. Um, and then also usually a sacred object or a natural object of some kind. So you'll notice it's a stone. So you'll notice a lot of the things that apply to Shinto, you also can think about them applying here. But again, by setting this type of scene, they believed they were creating a sacred space to be inside that was influenced by nature and that they could use while undertaking the tea ceremony. So again, looking at this space, you'll notice there almost is like a little Shinto kami house over on the left, various sacred stones, and then you would take your shoes off, right? And then you could move up into the space of the tatami elevated mats, and again, move the fusama walls as needed. Now, I spoke before about, this idea of essentialness or the use of space in a very essential way for Japanese people. They believe very strongly that you keep your spaces clean. They never wear shoes in the home. Most Asian cultures, this is the norm. You would have your outside shoes and your inside shoes. Um, so there's a sense of keeping the space clean. And they also like to have flexibility in their space, kind of a sense of multiple uses if necessary. And so this is why they like using the fusama or the sliding rice paper walls, because they felt that you could make spaces smaller or larger as necessary. When I'm in a classroom with my students, I always point to around our classroom and I say, this is a very fixed space. It's a very Western space. It really only has one purpose and one usage, to seat 60 students in a lecture environment. There's really no way to alter it. And I always say this would probably make a Japanese person crazy because they want to have flexibility in how they can use spaces. When you go into a Japanese home, a traditional Japanese home, again, they could pull a fusama wall into place and create another room for a bedroom, let's say, or another private space. And when I talk to Asian people who have homes designed here in America, they usually try to have a couple different flex rooms, as they put it, rooms that they can use for different purposes. So the idea of sort of set walls and set spaces, it's just not really part of their culture or their heritage. Again, cleanliness and flexibility of spaces is really something that they honor. And I think this is because they live on islands with not a lot of space to move around. A lot of the urban spaces is very congested. And so you had to be very careful about how you use space and use it in a very purposeful way. So we'll think about that a little bit more when we look at some contemporary art and architecture as well. But again, the sense of using what was essential, I think, is really at the heart of how a tea house is planned. And I think that what it comes down to for me is they believed a life that embraced the basics was a much more thoughtful existence. When I sort of look at Asian culture, I always see a simplicity to it. There's not a lot of accumulation of objects. There's not a lot of accumulation of things for the sake of things. There's always, to me, more of a paring down or a taking away or elimination method that's going on. Just looking at this tea house again, you'll notice it's very sparse. It's very simple. It has the meditative art piece on the wall. It has the tatami and the fusama and the one single hanging light. It's just, there's nothing over the top about it. It's just pared down to only what you need, only what is necessary. And again, when I look at Asian culture, I see that there's an honor of what is needed, not, I need to have more stuff because. So where our culture, I think we try to add too much in to the point where it becomes overwhelming sometimes. I think with their culture, they're always taking away, they're always paring down, and they're asking you what's essential. And again, the tea house to me is a place that combines art and architecture and ceremony and ritual in the space. And so it's used for a very specific function, but again, it honors all the sort of elements that Shinto on up as far as, you know, philosophies that honor nature are concerned. The last item of discussion before we leave historical Japanese culture is the discussion of Buddhism, of course. And one of the things I'm always hoping you're noticing is that as we travel to each new culture and you look at the Buddha, you'll notice he changes to reflect the look of the people that he is now being embraced by. So if you look at an Indian Buddha, I definitely think it looks very different from a Japanese Buddha, and so on and so forth, right? A Chinese Buddha, a Thai Buddha. They all look a little different, right, from each other to honor the culture that they are set within. And probably the best place to look at Buddhism in Japan is the Nara complex, the Nara temple complex. I mentioned before, if you look at the architecture, you'll notice there's the sort of flipped up roofs. We call these dragon roofs. And so you see that as a very typical look or style of Japanese architecture. Nara is an interesting complex because they actually had one or two major fires. And so parts of the complex burned down and then it had to be rebuilt. So some of it is very ancient and then some of it is very new. So it's really it's a living complex, right? That has to kind of be added on to over and over. And the complex of Nara is related to Zen Buddhism. I already spoke to this briefly, but I mentioned that Zen Buddhism is very much focused on meditation. It's Chan Buddhism in Chinese, right? So it's Chan in the Chinese version, Zen for the Japanese version. And the express focus is meditation. That meditation is the vehicle that takes you to the goal of enlightenment or nirvana. And so that's really what they focus their whole practice on is the meditative practice itself. And they use various methods, to unlock the mind. And one of my favorites is the use of the koans or the sort of nonsensical questions. The most famous one, of course, is what is the sound of one hand clapping? And when they ask these questions, they know there's no real answer in a sense. Like there's no real answer to be had. It's supposed to be something that helps you ponder the world around you and go, can you answer that? Is there an answer for that? It's supposed to help unlock your mind by troubling it or you're confusing it. So it's kind of a fun practice, I think, to consider. And I always have one person who sits in the class and just holds their hand up and starts to move it. And I'm like, that's not the answer. It's not literal. If you're being literal, you're missing the point of Zen Buddhism. If you walk around the complex, you'll first, of course, see these little kami shrines or spirit shrines that are linked all the way back to Shinto practice. So if you see these, they're very, 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 very old practice linking back to Shinto. So just like in China, Taoism sort of was embraced into Buddhism. What we see in Japan is that Shinto is really embraced into Buddhism as well, right? They complement each other. Rather than being something where Buddhism has to reject Shinto, it just welcomes it in. So you see the little Shinto kami shrines around the complex. As you walk around the various temples, of course, you're going to see various Buddha images and Bodhisattva images. If you remember, the Bodhisattvas are like saints in the Christian tradition. So you'd see these different important figures from Buddhism. Remember, none of them gods, right? All of them just important, figures to follow. Buddha, of course, for his philosophy. And of course, you'll see figures like Maitreya, the Bodhisattva of wisdom, and different really important bodhisattvas as you walk around. Most of these statues are huge in scale, and you'll notice they use a lot of bronze and metals to create a lot of this sculpture as well, which we haven't seen a lot of before this talk. My favorite part of Nara, of course, is that they actually have a deer park. So just like the famous deer park at Sarnath, where the Buddha began his preaching ministry, they actually have a herd of deer here that harken back to that practice, and I always think that's just such a delightful little sort of fact. And looking at the Nara Temple over on the left, again, notice the flipped up roofing, right, that we call the dragon roofing style. And if you've been to Epcot in Disney World, this building might look very, very familiar to you because it's replicated at the site. So you have the Temple of Heaven, right, Tiantan in China, and you have the Nara Complex Temple, right, in Japan. So um, representing cultures to you through simulacrum, we say, or replicating a building to replicate the culture. It helps people learn, so it's kind of interesting to consider. But that style, that dragon roof style, as I mentioned before, is a very typical way that we look at architecture as sort of architectural approach, right, in Japan, and a very familiar look, right, that you see used.